Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world where the air smells faintly of damp stone, beeswax candles, and the sour tang of fermenting grain. You're not in your comfy bed anymore, you're trudging through a monastery in medieval Europe, sometime around the 12th century, where monks keep their heads bowed and their mouths mostly closed. The floor is cold beneath your feet, the walls echo every step, and you realize that if you were actually living here, you probably wouldn't survive this lifestyle for more than 2 days. But for tonight, you get the easy version, the whispered tour, the quiet brewing, and the strange comfort of a place that believed silence could make the beer taste holier. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love to know, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it in your corner of the world? Drop it in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious about this little sleepy community we've built. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a cloister corridor before dawn, and the air has that heavy pre-morning stillness. Your breath fogs slightly in the chill. A bell has just rung in the distance, low, resonant, and vibrating through your chest. This is the monks' wake-up call. They shuffle past you in long robes, hoods low over their heads, sandals scraping softly on stone. You realize you're the only one not wearing a habit, which makes you feel like the awkward kid who showed up to a costume party in jeans. The monks move with practiced efficiency. No chatter, no banter, just the swish of robes and the faint clatter of wooden beads. They're heading toward the chapel for matins, the nighttime prayers held in darkness or near darkness. It's maybe 4 in the morning, a time when you'd normally be clutching a pillow, but here the day begins before the sun. A torch flickers against the wall and you notice a painting, primitive, stiff-looking figures of saints with big eyes. The paint is cracked, but you can tell it was meant to watch over this hallway. The monastery feels alive, not with noise, but with presence. Even the silence seems to hum. You get the impression that if you dropped a spoon right now, the sound would carry all the way to the abbot's chamber and get you in trouble. You follow the monks into the chapel. Inside, rows of narrow wooden stalls line the walls. They kneel, stand, bow chant movements that look both rigid and oddly graceful. The chant itself is low and droning, almost hypnotic, like bees murmuring inside a hive. You let your mind wander. It's easy to see how someone could doze off mid-prayer. In fact, historians still argue whether some monks intentionally mumbled nonsense just to fake their way through these long stretches of chanting. Imagine faking Latin half asleep. That's dedication. After prayers, the community disperses. Some monks return to their cells, others head toward the scriptorium to copy manuscripts, and a select few, our brewing monks, slip toward the brewery. You shuffle along behind them, careful to stay quiet. Outside, the sky is still navy blue, the first hint of dawn just barely softening the horizon. The grass crunches underfoot, wet with dew. The brewery is nothing glamorous, just a sturdy stone building with a peaked roof and a faint curl of smoke rising from a chimney. Inside, it's warmer, and the smell hits you instantly, roasted grains sweet and earthy like bread crust and porridge. There's also a tang of yeast, sharp enough to sting your nose. It's comforting and strange at the same time, like waking up in a kitchen where someone's been baking all night. Here's a mainstream fact to ground you: by the Middle Ages, monasteries were among the most advanced centers of brewing in Europe. Their beer wasn't just a treat, it was a necessity. The water supply was often dodgy, carrying all kinds of invisible nastiness. Beer, with its boiling and fermentation, was safer to drink than water, even for children. You might be thinking, wait, kids drinking beer? Yep, but don't panic. It was usually small beer, very low in alcohol, basically liquid bread. The monks light a few more candles. Their shadows stretch long across the walls. One monk checks sacks of grain stacked neatly in the corner. Another stirs something in a wide wooden vat with a paddle taller than you. They work silently, but you can sense a rhythm, a choreography. Every action has been repeated countless times before. Here's a quirky tidbit for you: some monasteries brewed with water piped directly from sacred springs, believing that the holiness of the source improved the beer. Imagine labeling your six-pack at the grocery store. Now with 30% more blessed water. But as your eyes adjust, you notice that this brewing space isn't entirely practical. Arched ceilings soar overhead, unnecessarily grand for a workplace. Narrow windows filter pale light onto the floor. Even here, among the smells of malt and yeast, the architecture reminds you that this isn't just a kitchen, it's a holy craft. Beer isn't made only to slake thirst, it's an offering of labor to God. And still you're wondering, did every monk really appreciate this lifestyle? Historians still argue whether some secretly resented the endless chores. Imagine being stuck stirring a vat at dawn, thinking, Brother Matthew got to copy illuminated manuscripts while I'm sweating next to hot mash again. But discipline was the rule. Complaining was frowned upon. Silence was safer. The room grows warmer as the fire beneath the kettles is stoked. You hear the crackle of wood, the low bubbling of liquid, and the occasional clink of a ladle against metal. Your eyelids grow heavier. The atmosphere is strangely soothing, like white noise made of medieval sounds. You realize you could fall asleep right here, leaning against a barrel, and honestly, no one would notice. The monks aren't paying you any mind. They're too absorbed in their brewing. By now, the sky outside has lightened to a pale grey. The first true morning of the monastery has begun. Soon the bell will ring again, calling the monks back to prayer, and their brewing tasks will pause. But you're still here, drifting deeper into the rhythm of their quiet world. The bell rings again, a deeper tone this time, pulling the monks out of their work. You trail after them, stepping carefully so your boots don't squeak against the stone floor. The rhythm of bells governs everything here. Time is not yours. It belongs to the abbey, carved up into fixed slices that dictate when to pray, when to eat, when to copy manuscripts, and when to stir the steaming kettles of grain. You step into the cloister garden, a square of green framed by arcades. Dew still clings to the grass, and the air smells faintly of herbs from the kitchen plots nearby. A few monks walk with their hands tucked into wide sleeves, their eyes lowered. Others carry buckets or tools. The silence is remarkable, not absolute, but carefully maintained. The only sounds are the call of a distant crow, the shuffle of sandals, and the bell's long echo. This rhythm prayer, work prayer, again, was called the Divine Office. 8 times a day, bells rang out to summon the community. Imagine your modern life interrupted every few hours, not by phone alarms, but by a massive bronze bell shaking the very air. You might complain, but here the bell is not an annoyance. It's the heartbeat of the monastery, ensuring no one drifts too far into laziness or too far into their own thoughts. You follow the monks into the refectory, their dining hall. Long wooden tables stretch the length of the room, polished smooth by years of elbows and bowls. A single monk stands at a lectern near the front, reading aloud from scripture, as everyone else eats. Nobody talks. You lift your spoon, tasting a broth of lentils and cabbage, hearty but plain. Bread is coarse, chewy. There's a small cup beside you, filled not with water, but with beer, thin, cloudy, low in alcohol, but nourishing. This is breakfast in the cloister, simple, efficient, and fuel for the hours ahead. And here's your mainstream historical fact. Benedictine monasteries, following the rule of Saint Benedict, believed in a balance of prayer and labor, ora et labora. Brewing beer wasn't just a chore. It was part of that balance, a way to sanctify daily life through honest work. But here's a fringe tidbit to chew on. As you sip your small beer, some records suggest monks believed drinking beer could sharpen concentration during long prayers, almost like medieval coffee. Picture a monk downing a frothy mug before chanting psalms, an image far removed from the solemn paintings we usually see. After breakfast, monks scatter back to their assigned duties. You stick with the brewers, slipping into their rhythm. They head toward the water source, a channel of cold, clear stream, redirected through carved stone troughs. You lean over, touch the surface. It's icy enough to sting. One monk dips a bucket, then makes the sign of the cross before carrying it back toward the kettles. For them, every gesture blends practicality with reverence. Inside the brewery again, the monks resume their quiet choreography. One hauls grain, another stokes the fire. Nobody shouts instructions, they don't need to. Years of routine have made them move like gears in a clock, each action fitting into the next. You watch lulled by the rhythm, scoop, stir, strain, pray, repeat. And yet you can't help wondering, did the silence ever feel suffocating? Historians still argue whether monasteries truly maintained complete silence, or whether the grand silence applied only at night. Maybe during the bustle of daytime brewing there were whispers, quick jokes, or even grumbles when someone spilled a bucket of wort. Imagine centuries later scholars debating whether Brother Thomas once muttered, "Not again," under his breath. Silence leaves no record, which makes it strangely loud in history. The hours pass. The sun finally climbs above the abbey walls, spilling light through narrow slits of windows. Dust motes float in the beams like drifting prayers. The air in the brewery grows heavier, thick with steam. You find yourself drowsy again, half dreaming as the monks work. Every sound, fire, crackling ladles, clinking kettles, bubbling feels like part of a slow, sleepy symphony. And then another bell tolls. Time to pause, to step away to pray again. The monks wipe their hands, set down tools, and file out wordlessly. You linger a moment longer, taking in the hushed room, the scent of malt, the impression of centuries layered in silence. Life here is repetitive, yes, but repetition is the point. The bell carves the day into predictable arcs. The monks bend themselves into the rhythm until their lives resemble the steady bubbling of the beer itself, constant, patient, inevitable. And as you trail after them toward the chapel once more, you realize the pattern is seeping into you too. You're no longer thinking of hours or minutes. You're thinking of bells. You shuffle along with the monks as they head back to the brewery after the mid-morning prayers. The bells have faded, but their echo still hums in your chest like a ghostly vibration that never quite goes away. By now, the abbey is fully awake. Birds hop across the cloister roof. Somewhere, a novice sweeps with a straw broom, its scratchy sound mixing with the faint gurgle of water channels. Today's brewing begins in earnest, and it all starts with ingredients. You watch as a pair of monks roll in heavy sacks of barley from a storeroom. The cloth bags sag with weight, spilling dust that smells faintly sweet and earthy. One monk pauses, traces a small cross on the sack, and murmurs a blessing under his breath before cutting the cord and letting the grain tumble out. It's not just food, it's part of the sacred rhythm of labor. Here's your grounded fact: monasteries cultivated their own barley and wheat, often in fields surrounding the abbey. Growing, harvesting, and storing grain was as much a part of their cycle as brewing itself. Self-sufficiency was key, no medieval Amazon Prime for delivery. But here's your quirky tidbit, some records note. Monks occasionally experimented with rye oats, or even spelt when barley yields were poor. Imagine tasting a medieval experimental batch, the six-pack, labeled Brother Benedict's Oat Surprise. Not exactly craft beer marketing, but it proves even monks weren't above improvisation. The next step is water. You've already seen how seriously they take it, drawing from streams or springs, carefully protected from contamination. They believed the purity of water mattered almost as much as prayer. You crouch beside a trough, the surface rippling with morning light. Dip your fingers in, it's icy, flowing steady, and you can see why monks prized it. In a world where people feared bad water could sicken whole villages, clean sources were a treasure. Grain and water meet in the mash tun, and the alchemy begins. A monk pours the cracked barley into a wide wooden vat, then slowly adds the hot water, stirring with a paddle taller than you are. Steam billows up, clouding your face with the smell of sweet porridge. The monks stir methodically, arms flexing beneath wool sleeves, but their faces remain calm, almost meditative. You realize that in its own way, brewing is another form of prayer, slow, repetitive, full of patience. You lean in, watching the surface bubble gently. The mixture thickens, clumps, then smooths as the monk stirs. Your stomach growls a little. Honestly, it looks edible right now, like a massive pot of oatmeal. You wonder how many monks secretly scooped a spoonful when nobody was watching. Historians still argue whether early monks considered the brewing process fully holy or simply tolerated as necessary labor. Some claim the ritual of blessing grain and water elevated the act into sacred territory. Others think the monks were just practical people needed to drink and beer was safer than swampy water. The truth is probably somewhere in between, practicality wrapped in prayer. The mash rests. Heat and time coax the starches into sugars. The monks leave it covered with a heavy lid, steam leaking out around the edges. While they wait, they sweep the floormen tools or simply stand in silence. You notice how the air feels heavier in this room, now damp and warm, the smell clinging to your robe like invisible syrup. Outside, a novice rings a small handbell. Break time! The monks step out into the courtyard, where benches line the stone wall. They sip from wooden mugs filled with small beer, the weaker daily brew. You take a sip, too thin, slightly sour, but refreshing in its own strange way. The liquid feels less like alcohol and more like fuel, the medieval equivalent of a protein shake. Here's a detail worth savoring in times of fasting. Monks relied on beer as liquid bread, rich in calories and nutrients. Beer was sustenance, not indulgence. It was their loophole during Lent. Solid food is forbidden, but this mug of thick, malty goodness, perfectly acceptable. You glance back at the mash tun through the doorway, steam still rising. The abbey hums with quiet industry bees in the garden, a scribe hunched over vellum, a cook chopping onions, and here the beginnings of beer. Life is stitched together by countless small actions, each one part of a bigger tapestry. And you, drifting along in this rhythm, start to feel the pull of drowsiness again. The steady cycle of work, prayer, silence, and waiting is hypnotic. You could stay here forever, wrapped in the smell of malt and the calm of stone walls. But the next step is about to begin, and with it, a more complex flavor enters the story. The mash tun has cooled just enough, and now the monks begin the next stage, straining and flavoring. You stand at the edge of the room as one brother lifts the heavy lid, releasing a cloud of steam so thick it fogs your vision. The smell is sweeter now, almost caramel-like, as though someone left a pot of oatmeal simmering too long. They drain the liquid, the wort, into another vessel, leaving behind the grain husks. It trickles out golden and cloudy, filling the air with warmth. A monk presses down on the mash with a wooden paddle, squeezing every drop like someone determined to get that last squeeze of toothpaste. Waste not, want not. The spent grain won't be tossed, though it'll feed the monastery's animals, maybe even the pigs grunting in pens behind the abbey. This is when the magic of flavoring begins. Today you'd expect hops, but here in the early medieval centuries, hops weren't yet the universal choice. Instead, monks used grut, a mysterious mix of herbs and spices. You watch as a monk brings forward small bundles, wrapped in cloth, dried yarrow, wild rosemary, maybe even juniper or mugwort. He unwraps them with care, as though unveiling relics. The smell is pungent, sharp, medicinal. Here's your mainstream fact. Before hops took over around the 12th to 13th centuries, European brewers often flavored beer with grut, and monasteries had special rights to sell or control it in some regions. It gave beers a wide range of flavors, from floral and spicy to downright bitter. Now here's your quirky tidbit. Some of these herbs had mild hallucinogenic effects. Imagine a weary pilgrim stopping at the abbey, sipping a mug, and suddenly seeing angels in the rafters. Medieval nightlife courtesy of monk-approved grut. The monks sprinkle the herbs into the boiling wort. The room fills with complex aromas, herbal, woodsy, almost like incense at Mass. The line between church and brewery blurs even further. You breathe deeply, half dizzy from the heat, half entranced by the perfume. And yet not everyone agreed about these ingredients. Historians still argue whether some monasteries deliberately crafted beer to be mildly intoxicating beyond alcohol's effect, or whether it was simply the result of using what grew nearby. Was Brother Anselm a spiritual guide or an accidental party host? The debate lingers. The monks stir slowly, and the boiling intensifies, bubbling and spitting like a cauldron in some fairy tale. You lean back just far enough to avoid the splash. The fire underneath crackles, sending sparks up the chimney. Shadows leap across the stone walls. It feels almost theatrical, an alchemy performed in hushed reverence. Hours pass in this simmering haze. The monks barely move except to stir or add more fuel to the fire. You feel your eyelids drooping, lulled by the repetitive motions and the steady bubbling. Your mind drifts. You imagine pilgrims arriving at the abbey gate, dusty from the road, guided here by the promise of shelter, bread, and this very brew. A bell rings again, sext the midday prayers. The monks pause their work, cover the vat, and file out. You follow into the chapel, where sunlight now pours through stained glass, painting the floor in fractured colors. The chant rises again, low and steady, blending with the echo of boiling wort, still in your ears. The whole day feels like one long song, alternating verses of prayer and brewing. After prayers, they return to strain and cool the wort. A monk lifts a wooden bucket, carrying it carefully to a set of large open tubs where the liquid can breathe and cool. The air shifts. You can smell the herbs more clearly, now sharp and lingering, clinging to your clothes. And as you stand in the warm brewery with the cooling tub steaming faintly in the light, you realize this is the turning point. Grain and water are no longer just porridge. They've become something alive, waiting for the final touch. The silence here is not oppressive. It's comforting, like a blanket wrapped around the brewing process, holding it steady. You lean back against the stone wall, half listening to the bubbling, half lost in the hypnotic rhythm of monks moving silently around the room. And though your body is heavy with drowsiness, you know the next stage will be even stranger, the invisible work of yeast, where nothing seems to happen, and yet everything changes. The tubs of wort sit uncovered, steam lifting like soft ghosts toward the rafters. You lean over one, watching the faint ripples where heat escapes when a monk gestures for you to step back. He knows what's coming. The miracle stage. The quietest part of all. They bring forward crocks of yeast, though they wouldn't have called it that, not exactly. To them it was balm, the frothy residue skimmed from previous batches. They understood it worked, but not why. You watch a monk scoop the pale, foamy substance with a wooden ladle and drizzle it into the cooling wort. The foam melts into the liquid, barely noticeable, but you sense the shift instantly. Something alive has entered the brew. Here's your grounded fact. Medieval monks had no modern germ theory, but they knew yeast was essential, even if they thought of it more as a mysterious fermenting agent. They carefully cultivated and passed down strains from batch to batch, long before the word microbiology existed. Now here's your quirky tidbit. Some monasteries believed yeast had a personality, friendly or temperamental. A good yeast batch meant harmony in the abbey. A sluggish one, maybe Brother Thomas skipped prayers. It was superstition wrapped around science, but it gave fermentation an almost mystical quality. The tubs are left to sit. You hear it first, the faint fizz, the gurgle like a cat purring deep in its chest. Then the surface begins to stir. Bubbles break lazily, releasing a tangy aroma. The air smells sharper now, bread dough left out too long with a hint of sour apples. It stings your nose, but it's oddly comforting, like being near something alive and busy. The monks stand around, the tubs, hands folded, watching in silence. They don't stir, don't interfere. The yeast works invisibly, transforming sugars into alcohol and carbonation. You realize this is the one stage where human labor gives way entirely to patience. Brewing becomes an act of faith. Trust the unseen weight and let the miracle unfold. Historians still argue whether medieval monks fully recognized yeast's role or simply saw fermentation as God's intervention. Was each batch proof of divine blessing, or did they quietly know it was natural, repeating without fail? The debate lingers in manuscripts, but watching here you feel the tension yourself between science and mystery, between chemistry and prayer. Hours pass. The tubs bubble gently and the room grows warmer. The smell is thick, heavy, filling your lungs. You find yourself swaying, lulled by the rhythm of bubbles popping as though the beer itself is breathing. The monks occasionally check the surface, skimming off excess foam, but mostly they wait. Silence deepens around the process. At one point, a young novice tiptoes in, curious, and leans too close. A senior monk gently pulls him back with a firm hand on the shoulder. You notice the look exchanged. It's almost protective, like guarding a newborn child. That's how precious this stage is. Any contamination, a stray leaf or speck of dirt, could ruin the whole batch. You sit on a bench against the wall, watching the slow dance of bubbles. Your eyelids feel impossibly heavy. You imagine drifting off and waking hours later to the same soft gurgle, unchanged except for a deeper aroma. The room feels timeless, as though centuries might pass while the yeast continues its work. And yet this invisible labor has consequences beyond the monastery. Beer fermented properly is safer, more nourishing, and more stable. Pilgrims will drink it. Nobles may even order barrels. The reputation of the abbey could rise or fall on these bubbles. A monk passes you a small wooden cup. It holds an early taste, a sample drawn from a previous batch already fermented. You sip. It's sourer than modern beer, cloudy, heavy on the tongue, but strangely satisfying. You feel warmth spread through your chest. Liquid bread, indeed. The monks return to prayer again, leaving the yeast to work alone. You linger, listening to the tubs, each bubble like a heartbeat. Brewing may seem loud, fires boiling, stirring, but this stage is quieter than a whisper, the loudest silence you've ever heard. And as you sit there, drowsy and content, you sense that the silence itself has weight. Soon it will be broken not by bells, but by the small, necessary whispers monks allow themselves when the brewing reaches its trickiest stage. The room is still filled with the soft fizz of fermenting beer, but now something new creeps in hushed voices. You catch them like faint ripples on water, low murmurs that shouldn't exist in a world ruled by silence. The monks bend toward each other, gesturing with their hands, whispering instructions too urgent to leave to chance. It's as if the strict vow of silence has sprung a few cracks, and through them words slip like smoke. You watch two brothers check a tub. One points to the foam, the other nods, and for the first time you hear a voice, soft but clear, still strong. The words float into the air and vanish, that's all. No chatter, no gossip, just the bare minimum needed to keep the brewing on track. Here's your grounded fact. Many monasteries had systems of sign language to avoid breaking vows of silence, but brewing was tricky enough that sometimes whispers were allowed. Safety and precision mattered more than rigid rules. Now for your quirky tidbit, some abbeys actually had illustrated sign language charts hanging in the brewery. Imagine little pictures of a hand making the barley sign, or a gesture for too much foam. The medieval version of workplace posters, safety first, don't drop the yeast. The monks move like shadows, communicating more with glances than with words. You feel the tension in the room. Fermentation can go wrong in countless ways. Too warm, too cool, too slow, too fast. Everyone's watching for subtle signs. The faint whispering feels almost conspiratorial, like you've stumbled into a secret society, even though all they're doing is babysitting beer. Historians still argue whether monastic silence was truly universal or more of an ideal than a reality. Was every word forbidden, or did monks bend the rules during practical tasks? Maybe both. Standing here listening to a slip of whispered Latin, you realize rules are never as solid as they look on paper. Even silence has loopholes. Hours stretch on. The yeast gurgles steadily, and the monk's whispers fade back into hand signals and nods. You hear sandals scuff on the floor, the occasional cough, and the pop of bubbles. Otherwise it's quiet again, so quiet you can almost hear your own heartbeat. A monk approaches with a candle stub, holding it close to the vat. The foam flickers in the light, golden and frothy alive. He lowers his head as if listening. You realize he isn't just checking progress, he's communing with it, treating the fermentation like a partner, a silent co-worker in the abbey's labor. The room smells sharper, tangier, the sour sweet scent of yeast in full force. It fills your nose, clings to your clothes, seeps into your skin. You imagine walking out later and carrying the smell of beer everywhere you go, like a living advertisement. This person has been brewing. Your mind drifts again. You think of the rules, the silence, the whispers. Imagine being a novice here, 18 years old, told never to speak except in prayer, and then discovering that the one place words sneak out is in the brewery. No wonder brewing felt special, an odd pocket of freedom within the strict order of the cloister. One monk ladles out a small cup and hands it to another. They sniff, taste, nod in agreement. Another whisper, "Good." That single word feels weighty, decisive, like a judgment. The beer is becoming what it needs to be. The bells call again, pulling them away to prayer. They leave the brewery one by one, robes, swaying sandals brushing stone. You're left behind the vats, still bubbling the air, still rich with yeast. You lean against the wall, listening. The silence settles once more, but it's no longer absolute. You've heard the cracks, the whispers, the proof that even in a world of rules, human voices find ways to leak through. And that makes the silence here feel less like oppression, more like choice, something maintained carefully with just enough give to keep the beer alive. And soon, when the monks return, you'll see how that beer becomes more than drink. It becomes food survival, the loophole that carried them through long fasting days. The vats are alive with gentle bubbling, but the monks have returned now, hands folded neatly as they gather mugs and ladles. This is not just taste testing, it is preparation. You notice how carefully they portion out the drink, not in celebration, but in duty. One by one, they lift wooden cups, sip, swallow, and then move on as if they've just taken medicine. For the first time, you're offered your own. The liquid is cloudy amber with a thin foam clinging to the rim. You sip. The taste is malty heavy with a herbal sharpness that lingers at the back of your throat. It's more bread than beverage, more fuel than indulgence. You imagine trying to chug 3 of these after mowing your lawn. You'd be asleep on the porch before dinner. Here's your grounded fact: monastic beer earned the nickname liquid bread because it was genuinely nourishing. During fasting seasons, when solid food was limited, monks consumed beer to keep their strength. It wasn't a loophole so much as an accepted part of spiritual discipline. Now for the quirky tidbit: some monasteries brewed beer so rich and strong during Lent that outsiders joked monks lived better while fasting than peasants did all year. Imagine being a farmer gnawing on a stale crust of bread while the abbeys down the road was slurping hearty mugs of calorie-packed brew. The monks drink quietly, their faces calm, but you can see relief flicker in their eyes. Hunger is a constant here. Meals are sparse vegetables boiled into thin broth bread, dense and plain. But beer carries weight. It fills the belly, slows the gnawing ache. For a few hours they can focus on prayer and work without their stomachs growling like restless wolves. Historians still argue whether monks saw beer as a true sacrament or simply as fuel. Some documents suggest abbots defended heavy brewing by calling it a gift from God for survival. Others think the monks just leaned heavily into the loophole, enjoying a hearty buzz in the name of holiness. Truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in between. You sit at the long wooden table, cup in hand, surrounded by monks in silence. The air is heavy with yeast sweat and the faint tang of herbs. A single brother reads aloud from scripture, his voice echoing against stone walls. It's rhythmic, almost musical, blending with the muted sounds of mugs being set down. You're struck by how ordinary and sacred blend seamlessly here. Eating, drinking, praying, it's all one motion, no distinction. As the meal ends, the monks rise, bow, and file back to their duties. You follow them, weaving between corridors lined with flickering candles. The weight of beer sits pleasantly in your belly, a warmth that makes the stone halls feel less cold. Outside, pilgrims arrive at the abbey gate. Dusty, weary, leaning on staffs, they're greeted not with chatter, but with mugs. A lay brother pours from a barrel, the foam rising, the smell drifting. Pilgrims sip gratefully, sigh, and sink onto benches. For them, this beer is more than refreshment, it's welcome shelter, kindness in liquid form. You realize the abbey's beer is more than survival for monks. It's hospitality, it's medicine, it's reputation. A weary traveler leaves with the taste lingering on his tongue, telling others along the road that Abbey has the best brew. And slowly, word spreads like yeast itself, bubbling into fame. As the sun dips low, shadows stretch across the courtyard. The monks return once more to prayer, their chants rising like soft waves. Your own head grows heavy, lulled by the rhythm of bells, the fullness of beer, and the endless cycle of silence, broken only by whispers. And yet as you close your eyes, you sense that within these stone walls brewing is more than sustenance. It is survival disguised as devotion, and devotion disguised as survival. Soon you'll see how this sacred brew travels beyond the abbey, shaping not just monks, but travelers, villagers, and even taverns in towns nearby. The next morning, the abbey stirs again before sunrise. The bells toll, the chants rise, and the same routine unfolds. But as you trail the brewing monks, you sense something different today, an air of anticipation. The beer that began as grain water and whispers is ready to move beyond the cloister walls. You follow as barrels are rolled out of the brewery, heavy wooden casks sealed with iron hoops. They creak across the courtyard, leaving grooves in the damp earth. A pair of lay brothers heave them onto a cart bound for the guest house, an extension of the abbey, where travellers rest, eat, and most importantly, drink. Inside the guest house, long benches stretch beneath timber beams blackened with smoke. The air is warmer here, busier and less hushed than within the abbey itself. Pilgrims crowd the benches, some weary and dust-streaked others, chatting softly, their voices echoing under the rafters. For them this is sanctuary food for the body and soul, but also a place to swap stories of the road. Here's your grounded fact: monasteries across medieval Europe became famous for offering hospitality. They provided shelter, food, and yes, beer to travelers of all kinds, nobles, peasants, merchants, even the occasional rogue who managed to slip past the porter's careful gaze. Beer wasn't an afterthought, it was the centerpiece of welcome. Now your quirky tidbit: some records mention monasteries offering stronger beer to wealthy or influential guests, while common pilgrims got a thinner brew. Imagine arriving dusty and exhausted only to realize Brother Abbot poured the good stuff for the bishop while you're sipping medieval light. The lay brothers tap the barrel and the beer flows into mugs. The sound alone, froth gurgling into wood, feels like relief. You watch pilgrims lift their cups, clink softly, and drink deeply. Faces soften, shoulders relax. Some sigh aloud as if a burden has lifted with the first sip. It's not just nourishment, it's a reminder that kindness still exists in a harsh world. Historians still argue whether monasteries shared beer freely as charity or expected some form of donation in return. Was it generosity or clever reputation building? Either way, the effect is clear. Abbeys became known as havens. Their beer, a liquid advertisement that spread along trade routes and pilgrim roads. You sit among the travellers, your own mug warming your hands. The beer is stronger here, fuller-bodied, richer than the small beer you tasted earlier. It sits heavy in your stomach, filling you with warmth, blurring the sharp edges of fatigue. You glance at the pilgrim beside you, his face lined from the sun, his hands blistered from walking. He catches your eye, smiles faintly, and raises his mug in quiet thanks. The monks drift through the room, not speaking much, but present. Their silence seems to calm the space, even as murmurs of conversation rise. You hear a story of a broken cart, a tale of relics glimpsed in a distant town, a warning about thieves on the road ahead. The beer loosens tongues, but the abbey's walls hold the words gently, like secrets that won't be repeated. You sip again, and the warmth spreads. Your eyelids grow heavy, lulled by the mixture of low voices crackling fire and the steady rhythm of mugs thudding onto wood. For a moment you feel yourself slipping into the timeless pattern. Monks brew, pilgrims arrive, beer flows, burdens lighten. It's as endless as the ringing of bells. Outside, the cart creaks on, carrying more barrels toward nearby villages. The abbey's influence doesn't end at its walls. Every mug poured in a tavern, every pilgrim stumbling away with a full belly, extends the monastery's reach. beer is not just survival, it is diplomacy, commerce, even quiet power. And yet behind that growing influence, secrets remain, recipes, guarded techniques, whispered only within cloisters, knowledge protected as carefully as relics. Soon you'll discover that not all beer is meant for every mouth, and the monks keep their brewing wisdom closer than scripture itself. The carts return empty by evening, their wheels clattering softly on cobblestones as the sun dips behind the abbey walls. You trail them back into the courtyard, where the brewery smells stronger than ever, roasted malt herbs and that tangy edge of fermenting yeast. The monks gather again, tending to the next batch with the same quiet diligence, but you notice something subtle. Not every barrel leaves the cloister. Some are stacked in a cool cellar beneath the abbey, kept apart from the flow of beer to pilgrims and villagers. You descend the stone steps with them, the air growing damp and cold. Torches flicker against rough walls, lighting rows of casks tucked into alcoves. The monks handle these barrels with unusual care, their movements deliberate, protective. You realize these are special brews reserved, hidden, not for the average pilgrim staggering through the gate. Here's your grounded fact: monasteries often guarded their brewing methods fiercely. Certain recipes were considered property of the abbey, handed down through generations, never shared outside the cloister. In some cases, monks swore oaths not to reveal proportions of herbs or techniques for fermenting. The secrecy wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Brewing skill gave the abbey prestige and income. Now your quirky tidbit there are medieval stories of monks caught sneaking recipes to rival brewers, punished not with exile, but with enforced silence or extra fasting. Imagine getting busted for espionage over beer. Today, corporate trade secrets involve lawyers. Back then it was a stern abbot saying, "Brother, no supper for you." You crouch near one of the barrels, running your fingers along the damp wood. You can almost hear the faint fizz of fermentation within. The monk beside you makes a sign of the cross, then steps away, as if even touching it too long might reveal something forbidden. These brews, you sense, are richer, stronger, perhaps even experimental. Not for weary peasants, not for random travelers, but for feast days, honored guests, or the abbot's table. Historians still argue whether some monasteries deliberately kept two tiers of beer, one for daily sustenance, thin and mild, and another for insiders or special occasions, rich and intoxicating. Was this double standard hypocrisy, or simply practicality? After all, why waste the good stuff on a passing pilgrim who might never return? You linger as the monks roll a single barrel from the cellar to the refectory. Tonight must be special. Inside, candles flicker against high stone walls. The air buzzes with a rare energy, though voices remain absent. Bowls of stew are set out, bread-broken mugs filled from the chosen cask. The beer here is darker, heavier, with a roasted bitterness that clings to your tongue. Stronger, richer, warming like fire in your chest. The monks sip slowly, savoring, their faces calm, but eyes alight. You feel a subtle camaraderie at this table, an unspoken bond built not just on prayer, but on shared indulgence. Even within the rigid silence, the room feels alive, almost celebratory. And you can't help but wonder, how many variations did these monks create over centuries? Recipes lost, rediscovered, forgotten again. Flavors that existed only for a season, then vanished when a brother died without passing them on. Each cask in the cellar might be a secret chapter of history, sealed behind iron hoops and oak staves. The candles burn lower. The monks finish their mugs, bow their heads in prayer, and file out, leaving the refectory dim and hushed. You stay behind, tracing the rim of your cup, tasting the last bitter foam on your lips. The secret feels heavy, like a story almost too important to tell. And yet secrets rarely stay hidden forever. Just outside the abbey walls, taverns brew their own batches, competing for thirsty villagers. Soon the sacred and the secular will clash, and beer will be caught in the middle. By the time dawn creeps back across the abbey's roofs, you're already awake, ears pricked, to the low rumble of wagons passing beyond the cloister. The sound isn't unusual. Trade routes wind past the monastery, but you notice something sharper, almost defensive, in the way the brothers glance toward the road. They're guarding something, and you already know what it is: their beer. The monks' brewing isn't happening in a vacuum anymore. Just outside the abbey walls, village taverns and independent brewers are catching on. Beer is good business, and nothing spreads faster than the reputation of a mug well poured. As you step into the courtyard, you see a group of lay brothers loading another cart with casks, this time bound for a nearby market town. The abbey's emblem is branded on each barrel as if to announce, this is not just beer, it's holy beer. Here's your grounded fact. Monasteries across medieval Europe didn't just brew for themselves, they sold beer, and often at higher quality than most secular taverns could manage. Their knowledge of sanitation, access to clean water, and careful techniques meant monastic beer was safer and more consistent than village ale. Now your quirky tidbit tavern owners sometimes complain that monks were unfair competition since abbeys didn't pay taxes the same way. Imagine running a small bar and your biggest rival is God's own brewery, not exactly an even playing field. As the barrels roll out, you decide to follow the cart to the village. The road is dusty, lined with hedges and crooked trees, and soon the wooden wheels creak into a square buzzing with chatter. Villagers haggle over breadcloth and saltfish, but the loudest voices cluster near the tavern door. Inside, the air smells thick sweat hay and weak ale. You duck through the doorway just as the abbey's barrels arrive. The tavern keeper scowls. He knows what's coming. When monks deliver beer, villagers flock. The crowd presses forward, mugs in hand, eager to taste what they call God's brew. The first cask is tapped froth, spilling into clay cups. Cheers erupt, even if voices quickly drop back to whispers in respect. You sip along with them and instantly notice the difference, smoother, fuller, cleaner than the sour, inconsistent village ale you sampled earlier. No wonder locals prefer it. Historians still argue whether abbeys meant to dominate local beer markets or if their success was just a byproduct of quality. Some scholars claim monks undercut taverns, deliberately boosting abbey income. Others believe monks were simply brewing as part of their vocation, and it was secular taverns that felt threatened. Either way, the clash was real, and in some regions local authorities had to step in. You lean against the wall watching as villagers laugh and drink, while the tavern keeper pours his own weaker brew into neglected mugs. There's no contest. His beer tastes like stale bread left in a puddle. Monks, with their quiet discipline, have turned brewing into both science and art. The competition isn't just economic, it's cultural. In the tavern, voices rise, dice clatter, songs break out in rowdy bursts. Beer here fuels gossip, flirtation, and brawls. Back in the abbey, it's ritual, survival, silent bonding. The same drink, two worlds apart. You realize beer is becoming a battlefield between sacred order and earthly pleasure. Later, as dusk falls, you follow the cart back to the monastery. The monks unload what's left, moving with the same steady rhythm as always, as though nothing has changed. But you know now beyond the walls their beer is more than nourishment. It's influence, wealth, even controversy. And accidents, you'll soon discover, sometimes shaped that influence more than any plan. A scorched batch here, a spoiled cask there, each mishap nudged beer into new forms, some of which would survive for centuries. The brewery smells different tonight, darker, sharper, almost burnt. You follow the monks inside and quickly see why. The kettle has boiled too long, and the malt at the bottom has scorched. The air carries a bitter edge like toasted bread pushed too far in the fire. A mistake. Or perhaps something new. The monks move quickly, stirring, muttering prayers under their breath, as though a blessing might reverse chemistry. The abbot inspects the dark mash with narrowed eyes, his silence heavy. This is where discipline meets chance. You watch the liquid swirl, uncertain if it's ruined or transformed. Here's your grounded facts and beer styles like darker roasted brews may have originated from accidents, barley, overheated kettles left too long on fire. Rather than waste it, monks tasted, adjusted, and sometimes discovered flavors that became beloved traditions. Now your quirky tidbit, one medieval record hints at a monastery blaming a distracted novice for burning malt. His punishment: he wasn't kicked out, he had to drink the whole batch himself. That's one way to handle quality control. You sip from a ladle dipped into the scorched brew. The taste is bitter smoky, unlike the soft sweetness of yesterday's beer. Your tongue curls, but there's something intriguing in the aftertaste, a depth that lingers. You can imagine a weary pilgrim appreciating the stronger bite even if it came from error. Historians still argue whether innovations in medieval beer were deliberate craft or lucky mistakes. Did monks carefully experiment, or did history stumble forward one spilled kettle at a time? You picture both scenarios: a meticulous brother weighing herbs with a quill-thin balance, and another frantically scraping burnt grain from the bottom of a pot. The vats bubble on, some batches spoil yeast gone wild, barrels leaking air too damp. And yet even spoiled beer found use. Farmers fed it to animals, brewers turned it into vinegar, households used it for cleaning. In a world where waste meant hunger, nothing was truly discarded. You trail the monks as they haul the scorched brew into casks. Tomorrow pilgrims will drink it without complaint, perhaps even delight. Beer was rarely the same twice after all. Each barrel had its own personality, shaped by weather grain, quality water source, and brewing quirks. Drinkers expected variation, it was part of the charm. At supper, the new beer is poured into mugs. You brace for sour faces, but to your surprise, the monks drink calmly, even approvingly. One raises an eyebrow, then takes a slower, more thoughtful sip. This accident, you realize, may become tomorrow's tradition. Later, by candlelight, you overhear whispers, one monk suggesting roasting grain intentionally to replicate the smoky taste. Another cautions against straying from purity. The debate is hushed but heated, carried on in glances and raised brows more than words. You realize brewing here is not static. It's alive, shifting with each mistake, adapting with each accident. The candles burn low, the mugs empty, and the monks retreat once more into the rhythm of prayer. You stay behind, staring at the dark dregs in your cup. What began as error might already be history in the making. And beyond these walls, the line between monk and tavern keeper blurs further. Both experiment, both adapt, and soon competition grows sharper than the bitterness of scorched malt. The night deepens, and once again you hear voices outside the abbey walls, this time sharper, less friendly. By morning, when you walk down the dirt path to the village, you see the tension. Clearly the tavern is busy, but not with laughter. The tavern keeper leans on his counter, scowling as a group of locals compare the mug in their hands to what they drank at the monastery yesterday. The verdict is obvious: his beer is thin, watery, and sour compared to the monk's full-bodied brew. The rivalry isn't just imagined, it's visible in every glance, every muttered word. The tavern keeper knows he can't match the monk's clean water, their skill, or their secrecy. He's fighting with crude tools against an army of disciplined brewers who pray while they stir kettles. Here's your grounded fact: by the late Middle Ages, records show actual disputes between monasteries and secular taverns. In some towns, local brewers petitioned civic authorities, claiming monks were flooding markets with untaxed beer, undermining their livelihoods. Now for the quirky tidbit: there's a surviving complaint from a brewer in Ghent who accused monks of selling beer so fine it made peasants forget their chores. Imagine that: beer so good your boss thinks it's ruining productivity. Inside the tavern, the tension simmers. A farmer grumbles that he can't afford both church tithes and monastery beer prices. Another villager shrugs, pointing out that at least the monk's beer doesn't make him sick. The tavern keeper slams a jug down harder than necessary, foam spilling across the table. Competition breeds bitterness, not just in flavor. Historians still argue whether monks consciously intended to dominate the beer trade or simply brewed better out of necessity. Were they businessmen in robes or just practical survivors whose skill outpaced the layman around them? You suspect both are true, depending on the abbey, depending on the abbot. As you leave the tavern, you notice villagers carrying small jugs sneaking off toward the abbey gate. They knock softly, and a lay brother exchanges their coins for a portion of beer. The abbey's guest house isn't just for pilgrims anymore. It's edging into tavern territory, one mug at a time. Back inside the monastery, the monks remain calm, but you sense the tension beneath the silence. They know their beer is spreading. They know it makes enemies as well as friends. Yet they keep brewing day after day, kettle after kettle, as though divine duty outweighs earthly squabbles. The bells ring and chants rise once more. You close your eyes, the melody softening your thoughts. But even through the quiet, you can't ignore the truth. Beer is no longer just sustenance, no longer just charity. It's commerce, power, and rivalry. And soon it will spread beyond villages and taverns, flowing across Europe until it becomes part of kingdoms, guilds, and history itself. The abbey feels smaller now, not because the monks have changed, but because their beer has already begun to outgrow its walls. You follow a caravan along the trade road, casks of monastic brew strapped down beside sacks of wool and crates of salt fish. The air is filled with dust, the creak of wooden wheels, and the occasional grunt of a mule straining at its load. By the time you reach the next city, the difference is staggering. No quiet cloisters here, just crowded markets, bell towers ringing, and guild halls buzzing with merchants tallying profits. And yet even in this chaos, the monastery's beer has a presence. In a tavern at the edge of the square, a jug of Abbott's ale sits proudly on display, sold at a premium to wealthy merchants eager for a taste of sanctity in liquid form. Here's your grounded fact: monastic brewing influenced the development of city brewing guilds across Europe. As towns grew in the late medieval period, secular brewers adopted many of the techniques pioneered by monks, and guilds formed to regulate quality and protect trade. Now your quirky tidbit: some nobles were so enamored with abbey beer that they demanded barrels delivered directly to their castles. One German count even bragged in a letter that he kept monk's ale in his private chapel for both prayer and refreshment. Multitasking, medieval style. You sit in a bustling tavern, mug in hand, as merchants debate the merits of different monastic brews. Names of faraway abbeys are spoken with reverence as if they're luxury brands. One merchant swears by a Flemish abbey's dark ale. Another insists the pale brew from a Bavarian monastery is unmatched. The beer has become currency of reputation, traded in stories as much as in silver. Historians still argue whether the monks intended their influence to spread so far, or if the growing demand simply pulled their beer into broader markets. Did abbots strategize quietly, building empires of ale, or did it all unfold naturally, driven by thirsty pilgrims and ambitious merchants? The guilds, however, are less ambiguous. In the city you hear about new brewing regulations, rules about who can brew, how strong beer can be, what ingredients are allowed. It's an attempt to rein in chaos, but also a response to monastic dominance. The monks had set the bar high, and now secular brewers needed a way to compete, to prove their ale wasn't second-rate. Night falls and you wander back toward the city gate. Outside, the caravan prepares to leave, casks reloaded, bound for yet another town. The beer rolls on, spreading flavor, tradition, and influence with every turn of the wheels. Back in the quiet of the monastery, monks are still stirring kettles, unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, that their work has become the foundation of an industry stretching across Europe. And yet history is not always a steady climb. Wars, reforms, and revolutions loom on the horizon. Many monasteries will fall, and with them their brewing traditions. But for now, the beer flows, carrying the abbey's legacy farther with each sip. You return to the abbey years later, or at least it feels that way. Time slips strangely in this story, and where once the cloisters hummed with steady brewing, now they stand quieter, emptier. The stone walls are the same, the bells still toll, but the brewery smells faint, like a memory fading. Something has shifted. The Reformation sweeps across Europe, reshaping not just faith, but livelihoods. Monasteries are dissolved in some regions, their lands seized, their monks cast out. The great casks are emptied or smashed, recipes lost in the turmoil. What was once sacred brewing becomes contraband relic or forgotten lore. You walk through a shuttered brewery, dust thick on the vats, cobwebs hanging where steam once curled. Here's your grounded fact: in countries like England, the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII in the 1530s destroyed centuries of brewing tradition almost overnight. Abbeys that had brewed for hundreds of years saw their knowledge scattered or erased. Now your quirky tidbit: in some cases, locals scavenged abandoned abbeys for leftover beer, sneaking into cellars like treasure hunters. Imagine stumbling into a ruined cloister and finding a hidden cask liquid gold amid rubble. Historians still argue whether brewing knowledge survived mainly through secular guilds, or if fragments of monastic tradition lingered quietly among displaced monks. Did those brothers carry recipes in memory, passing them down secretly? Or did the lineage break, leaving later brewers to reinvent what was lost? The debate remains unresolved like an unfinished hymn. And yet not all was lost. In certain corners of Europe, monasteries endured, especially in Catholic regions untouched by Protestant reform. There, brewing traditions held firm, nurtured in silence while the wider world shifted. You picture a lone abbey in the Bavarian hills, its brothers still stirring kettles, their chants unchanged, while kingdoms rose and fell around them. The centuries roll on. Industrial brewing emerges in cities with machines and profit margins replacing candlelight and cloisters. Monastic beer becomes a rarity, half legend, half luxury. The silence of the monks is drowned out by factory clamour, their modest guesthouse ales overshadowed by barrels sold in bulk across nations. You linger in the empty abbey, tracing your hand along the cracked wood of an old vat. It feels like a tombstone, an echo of what once was. The monks who brewed here are gone, their secrets dissolved into the soil. But as you close your eyes, you sense a whisper of yeast still alive, a spark waiting to be rekindled. And indeed, centuries later, it will be. A handful of monasteries will rediscover their brewing heritage, reviving recipes, branding their ales as Trappist, and selling bottles to a world that craves both authenticity and quietude. But before you sip that modern echo, you must first see how the survival happened, how monks rebuilt from fragments, and how beer found its way back into cloisters. The road brings you full circle back to a monastery that smells once more of yeast and roasted grain. But this isn't the Middle Ages anymore. The calendar has flipped forward centuries, and you find yourself in a quiet Belgian abbey, where modern bottles line the shelves alongside ancient barrels. The monks here are descendants in spirit, if not in name, of those you first watched in smoky, candle-lit breweries. They still rise at dawn, they still chant in stone chapels, and they still brew, but now the beer is sold not just to pilgrims at the gate, but to eager drinkers across the globe. You pick up a dark glass bottle, the label simple yet elegant, stamped with a seal you've seen whispered about online authentic Trappist product. Here's your grounded fact today: only a handful of monasteries, mostly in Belgium and the Netherlands, are officially recognized as Trappist breweries. Their beer is world-renowned, often ranked among the finest in existence, precisely because it blends centuries-old tradition with meticulous modern craft. Now your quirky tidbit monks at one abbey once tried to limit online resale of their beer by requiring buyers to sign a promise not to flip it for profit. Imagine that holy vows extended to your six-pack. You sit at a long wooden table just as you did centuries ago in your journey, but the mug in your hand is replaced by a bottle capped with steel. You pour it slowly, watching the golden foam rise, the carbonation fizzing with quiet joy. The taste is familiar, malty, complex, comforting, but also refined, a polished echo of the rustic brews you sampled in shadowed cloisters. Historians still argue whether today's Trappist beers are truly faithful continuations of medieval traditions, or if they're modern reinventions wrapped in monastic branding. You sip and smile. Maybe the truth doesn't matter. Maybe what matters is the feeling, the same sense of warmth, of nourishment, of quiet satisfaction that monks and pilgrims shared hundreds of years ago. The monks around you drink sparingly, their faces calm, their voices low. They're not running corporations, not chasing fame. Every euro earned is poured back into the abbey or into charity, a reminder that even in the modern world, beer here still carries purpose beyond profit. You lean back, bottle in hand, and let the centuries collapse into one moment. The dawn bells, the grinding of malt, the whispers by the vats, the laughter of pilgrims, the scowls of tavern keepers, the silence of dissolution, the rebirth of tradition. All of it lives here in this sip, in this quiet. And as your eyelids grow heavy, the story drifts into a wind down, softer and slower than before. The monks' chanting fades into a gentle hum like waves against a shore. The brewery smells recede into background warmth, the faint sweetness of malt blending with the hush of evening. You feel yourself floating, no longer trudging stone halls or sitting at crowded tables, but simply resting safe and quiet. The centuries of noise, bells, carts, arguments, toasts all grow distant like echoes in a long corridor. What remains is peace, a steady rhythm of breath, the weight of blankets, the comfort of knowing monks are still brewing, still praying, still tending to their work with patience that outlives empires. Your thoughts slow. The bubbles in your glass dissolve, the foam settles, and the world softens. It doesn't matter whether the recipe is ancient or new. It doesn't matter whether the beer is shared in silence or celebration. What matters is the stillness it leaves behind. You let go of the last traces of wakefulness. The story slips from your hands like an empty cup placed gently on a table. You are warm, you are safe, you are drifting. And somewhere in a quiet abbey, monks are still brewing silently, steadily, endlessly.